Londra'dan herkese merhaba. Ekonomi ve piyasaları takip ediyoruz. Londra bacağında bu hafta önemli bir haftaydı. Ekonomi yönetimi Londra'daydı. Yatırımcılarla buluştu ve bu haftadan yansıyan notları konuşacağız. Değerli bir konuğum var. Ekonomist Timothy Ash'le birlikteyiz. Hi Tim, welcome to our show.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
Actually, this week was an important one as the economy team from Turkey was in London and they had several meetings. First of all, did you have the chance to talk to them?
Yes, I attended some of the meetings. Yep.
So how was it? Anything new?
No, look, I mean, what was encouraging was I think the London investor base know and respect Minister Şimşek and Governor Karahan very well. I think individually they've been in London, quite a lot, and obviously in New York, etc. I think the feedback from investors was pretty positive, right? I mean, they respect what they've achieved, which is pretty remarkable in the last year and a half. If you think of FX reserve accumulation, you look at the protected FX deposit reduction, they raised rates more aggressively than people expected. There's some positive momentum on inflation. Obviously, we've begun a rate cutting cycle. I think the investor feedback was positive from what I could make out. Nothing particularly new, I guess, in terms of the message. Obviously, as I said, the rate cutting cycle has started. My personal view is that inflation is pretty sticky. Growth has been pretty resilient. It's going to be a hard battle against inflation. Like I said, they began the cutting cycle early. Maybe they need to continue to be pretty hawkish in the short term to deliver more significantly in terms of disinflation.
Do you think we'll have a rate cut next week?
I think I think the messaging in the short term is, we are likely to see, continued cuts to the second quarter, and then let's see where we are in terms of inflation. That's just my understanding of, reading, the commentary from the MPC meeting and all various interactions. Obviously nothing specific has been said around that. It's just my read of things.
Do you think the amount will be around, again, 250 basis points?
Look, I think we will probably see continued measured reductions. I don't think it's going to be more than 250, maybe less. Mm-hmm. But something up to 250 will probably be the pace that we see, and then maybe a further consideration towards the middle of the year in terms of what they're doing in terms of rates.
Tim, is there anything specific that the foreign investors are waiting to be convinced?
Look, I think it's fair to say there is a bit of skepticism about whether the central bank moved too early to cut rates, right? I mean, if you look at the inflation story, I mean, obviously, headline is beginning to fall, but as I said, it's still pretty sticky. Fiscal policy was not very supportive for disinflation in 2024. It may begin to be a bit more supportive for disinflation in 25, but maybe later in the year. In the end, expectations are still pretty high. So, I mean, there is a debate, I guess, in the investor community. I mean, I think it's interesting, foreign investors, they've been long Turkey credit, so Turkey Eurobonds, they've been long the lira. They believe the fact that there's a real exchange rate anchor for the disinflation the central bank's using. In terms of going long duration Turk GBs, I mean, normally when the rate cutting cycle begins, people begin to move into Turk GBs. And there's been some evidence of that. But it's been somewhat limited, again, because people are a little bit skeptical about whether the central bank has perhaps moved a bit too early. But I think, giving perspective, as I said at the start, we are in a much, much better place than we were 2 years ago. These guys have achieved an incredible amount in that period. They've done much more than anyone expected. We need to give them a little bit credit for that. And, I do think that inflation is a massive domestic political problem that was shown, I think, in the local elections. I think there is an opportunity here to make a seismic landmark impact in terms of reducing inflation. I just question whether the early rate cuts, again, whether it was too soon, right? I mean, essentially, but we'll see. I mean, I don't have a crystal ball. I may well be wrong. They have a lot more information than I do. They are very credible. I mean, in the end, this is a very competent central bank. But we'll see what happens anyway.
You think that the rate cuts were early, but you still expect more rate cuts?
Well, I think, they get, they get that policy needs to remain restrictive, clearly. So, we're not going to see, we're not going to go back to, 3-4 years ago, right, of unorthodox policy. They get it. I guess it's just a debate about how restrictive policy needs to be to deliver a more meaningful disinflation, right? I guess is the right way to put it. So, but we'll see. I think, we may well see a more measured rate cuts than perhaps the market's expecting. And I would think that is the right strategy, I would argue, given the stickiness of inflation, and where we've been. We've had incredibly high inflation and we're coming down. And if you look at expectations, and again, going back to the growth, fundamentally, I think there has to be a growth give up to deliver significant disinflation. And really, there hasn't been much of a growth give up. And actually, some of the higher frequency indicators suggest that we're at the low in terms of the growth slowdown. And if anything, we may be seeing something of an acceleration, right? If anything.
So, when you look at the big picture, the world, Trump is coming, and there's turmoil, and people are afraid of the tariffs and everything. So, in this scenario, when you think of the latest Syria issue and the geopolitical risks as well, do you think Turkey might decouple in a positive way?
Yeah, look, I obviously the strong dollar is hurting plenty of emerging markets that appears for Turkey, right? We've seen big FX corrections elsewhere. That seems to feed through to inflation. The lira has been relatively stable, and I think in a way it reflects the fact that it has its own story, which is, this orthodox adjustment that we are seeing, right? A return to normalcy with the governor Garahan and Minister Şimşek delivering, positive change, right? So that helps underpin the Turkey story. It's an improving story without a doubt, right? From a credit fundamental perspective, we've seen that in terms of rating upgrades. And I think in terms of the geopolitics, Syria is clearly a big win for Turkey, without a doubt, right? Turkish companies will benefit from recovery and reconstruction in Syria. New markets in Syria will open. That will help. The challenge perhaps is, if we see return of refugees from Turkey into Syria, what does that mean for inflation in Turkey specifically, right? There are different views around that. One view is, rent inflation has been a problem in Turkey in terms of the disinflation story. Mass movement back of Syrian refugees, maybe it will reduce pressure on rental. But at the same time, Syrian workers are an important part of the Turkey labor market now, right? Huge different views in terms of how many Syrians are active in the labor market, but that could cause wage price pressure in Turkey, which would again be inflationary. And you mentioned Trump. Erdogan has a good personal relationship with Trump. That's clear. They're very transactional. Erdogan is very good at managing those kind of relationships, and Erdogan has something that Trump wants. Trump wants to get troops out of Syria. Erdogan has the ability to help that process, right? So after many years, I guess, when Turkey has been in a very challenging geopolitical space, perhaps at the moment it's basking in a much better environment, right? And certainly that helps, I guess, in terms of the Turkey macro and policy story, perhaps.
I heard that foreign investors asked questions about currency to Şimşek as well. There's a discussion whether TL is overvalued or, this real appreciation will continue or not. When you think about the strong dollar with Trump and Fed stopping the easing, do you expect any pressure on the currency in Turkey?
Well, look, I mean, in the end, the current account deficit is significantly reduced, right? We've seen enormous reserve accumulation, right? I mean, reserve accumulation because we've seen de-dollarization, we've seen capital inflows. That's telling a different story, right? I mean, that's suggesting that the lira is relatively well anchored. As I mentioned, it's a key anchor for the disinflation story, the real appreciation. I think the lira looks relatively well anchored. We will see nominal depreciation, obviously, and clearly exporters have been complaining, right? I mean, exporters always complain about the exchange rate. I mean, it's one of the, it's a perennial kind of problem. But I think perhaps a bigger problem for Turkish exporters may not be the exchange rate. A bigger problem may well be just global demand, and particularly in Europe. I mean, Europe. I've recently, this week, been at a big investor conference in Vienna, looking at the whole of emerging Europe, Hungary, Poland, all these Romania, all these countries, and there's a huge question mark about the European business model. Auto sector, manufacturing based on cheap Russian energy. I mean, that's kind of gone.
Yeah.
And that environment. Exporters who export to Turkey are struggling without a doubt, right? And inflation doesn't help those companies, right? So I just go back and say that the orthodox policies run by the central bank, fighting inflation, winning the battle inflation, ultimately is much more important in my mind to Turkish competitiveness than a one-off fix through a currency adjustment.
If you were a journalist and would like to put a headline for this week's Şimşek investor meetings, what would you say in one sentence?
Well, I mean, decent investor feedback. The investors trust the team. Perhaps views. There are various views. I mean, not everyone would agree with me that for a more measured rate cut environment, but I think that the market's willing to cut this team the slack. They do have confidence in this team. They're doing a good job. We need to continue to support them, and capital flows are returning to Turkey. I mean, that's certainly definitely a story, and there's a resilience there that has always been there, but actually in terms of Turkey, but I think there's a lot more confidence around Turkey. I think that's fair to say.
Do you expect flow into equities?
Well, I'm not an equity guy particularly. Obviously, the growth has been subdued because of the rate hiking cycle. Lower rates should help the equity market, one would assume. But obviously, as I said, the export sector is struggling because of the European growth environment, which is, I don't think that is going to suddenly miraculously turn around positively in Turkey's favour. But, Turkey has a diversified export structure. As I mentioned, Turkey should benefit from what's going on in Syria and sort of regional dynamics. If there's a peace in Ukraine, Turkey, again, should benefit massively from recovery and reconstruction. I imagine it could benefit from recovery and reconstruction in Ukraine and Syria, which would be a big boon for Turkey's exporters.
In terms of figures, do you expect this year to be better than last year in terms of flow? Can you figure any numbers?
Sorry, in terms of inflow?
In terms of flow of foreign investments in Turkey, do you think this year will be better?
Well, there's different types of investment, obviously. I mean, foreign direct investment has been very low in the last decade. I mean, if you think of the peak FDI period, which was the first decade of AKP rule. I mean, I think 2007, I think, was peak. I seem to remember 20 billion or something like that. And it's been very disappointing. I think that will slowly recover. We are seeing, I think, renewed interest in Turkey, particularly from the Gulf. But that, and the others in terms of portfolio inflows, I think we will see a gradual improvement in momentum. Investment to Turk GBs we'll need to see delivery in terms of disinflation, right? I mean, the market will have to be convinced that the fiscal and monetary policy is going to make a meaningful difference, and I guess we don't want to see inflation stuck sort of the mid-20s. We want to see perspective. I mean, remember, the central bank has a 5% inflation target ultimately, right? I mean, we're a long way from that. But if the market begins to, really believe that disinflation story, then we will see inflows into Turk GBs definitely. Because, I mean, there is an anchor on the FX side. I mean, the real appreciation certainly helps investor perspectives from a portfolio investor perspective.
Timothy Ash, thank you so much for joining our program.
My pleasure. Thank you.